Hello and welcome to the Sales Leaders series. I'm your host, Freddie, where I'll be gathering B2B SaaS sales leaders from across the world to answer 5 short, topical B2B SaaS sales questions. These questions are going to be the same each week, bar one, giving you insight and different perspectives into how top performers within the industry think, as well as actionable advice you guys can use in your own selling careers.
On this week's episode of the Sales Leaders series, I'm talking to Jamal Reimer. Jamal has over 30 years of experience in tech, software, and sales. Having started managing teams of reps and becoming a top performing rep himself, Jamal has gone on to become one of the most well-known and well-respected enterprise sales voices in his field. Having spent over 10 years climbing the ranks and perfecting the craft at Oracle, Jamal has since gone on to write a best-selling book, Mega Deal Secrets, founded multiple companies, including Outboundless, a creative outbound marketing company, and has started professional networks, including enterprise sellers, a network for ambitious enterprise sellers looking to network, learn and grow, become elite reps, and close life-changing deals. Outside of this, Jamal is also an LP for a go-to-market fund and acts as a strategic advisor for a host of different tech businesses, all in software and other industries. Jamal, that was a bit of a mouthful. Really appreciate you taking the time and chatting to me today.
Great to be here, Freddie.
So of all of the places I think we could start this conversation, of which there were many, looking into your background, Jamal, and what a vast background it is, I think it would be appropriate to start in a place where I think most people would probably know you for, at least from my background anyway, in starting out in sales, which would be LinkedIn. And you recently posted on LinkedIn about how you leverage senior board execs and advisors and introing into those guys into different accounts that you wanted to win. Can you talk about how you manage this process and also how you advise others and individual contributors wanting to do this for themselves? Because I know intros can be a daunting task, and going about that can be difficult for someone that hasn't done it before.
It's a great topic, and it's at best non-standard. And I think it's one of the best kept secrets in the B2B selling world. There seems to be almost a natural barrier to entry because most sellers, like the bulk of sellers, in the bell curve, don't really even conceive of not just going to their own executives, but going beyond that into the board of directors, board of advisors, investors, this really senior level of people who are aligned with their interests in terms of wanting the company to sell more, right? Growth is the name of the game. So for a lot of sellers, that whole world of introductions and, operating at that level doesn't really play into their day-to-day. But once they get kind of lit up to the idea, then it becomes, how am I going to do it? And then there's a whole nother barrier of expectation of wondering how's this supposed to work? So step one is really to go to your own management and say, hey, these are the accounts that I have, or I've identified these executives. One, do you guys, the executives, do you know anybody there? Okay, if you do or don't, can we also look at these other stakeholders within our own company, like the board members? And most often that's sporadic. Much, much less often it is systematized. And when I say systematized, it's still pretty light. Systematized would be, okay, as you are, doing research on your accounts and as you identify potential opportunities, here's the point at which it makes sense to start going up the chain and start to engage. Okay, when you do that, have a briefing document laying out the scenario and why you think that there's a deal there and who the important people are, et cetera. And then there's a vetting process, because you don't want to have, if you've got a good number of sellers, you don't want all of them going to the same executives or board members or investors or advisors all the time. That kind of wear them out. So you need a vetting process. And then you need your own executives and sometimes the board members to agree to a certain amount of involvement. could be as little as just, okay, go write an email and we'll send it from my account, all the way to, no, I'd like to be involved as an executive sponsor. So I've said a lot. Maybe I should take a pause.
No, it's incredibly interesting. And I'm wondering that whether, for me at least, I think in my experience in introing, is that mainly having that, or at least getting in contact with the execs within your company, as well as the board, is that more so leaning on them as a way of title matching, or is it more so just leaning on their network and just finding individuals? Is it either one or the other, or is it a little bit of both? I imagine
It's either one. You're going for, what's our best shot of success? Number one, is there a direct relationship? That is the absolute pinnacle of what you could get when searching for warm introductions. Why? Because to do larger deals faster, right? All sellers, sales leaders, individual contributors, we are all on the clock. And our mandate is to go bring in as much revenue as possible within a certain period of measured time, 4 quarters. We have to leverage, we have to use the concept of leverage wherever possible to actually do that, and especially to overperform, because sellers don't really enjoy the financial potential of their sales roles until they overperform above and beyond whatever their quota is. So number one, try to get that warm introduction, because you're leveraging existing relationships that could be years long. And then that sets you up to be pre-framed in a very positive way. So if I know somebody well and I'm trying to introduce you, Freddie, to them, and I say, hey, person who I've known for 10 years, my good friend who knows my kids, or, who we've been through thick and thin through, got battle scars together. I know this company and Freddie's a good guy. I think you should talk to him, because no question, he's just going to do it just because of the relationship with me. And then Freddie becomes really pre-framed very well. Okay, well, if Jamal likes him, he must be okay. I'm going to be all ears starting this conversation. Now, the next best is, no, I don't have a personal relationship, but either we know, common people in the networks, or maybe they can get me that first introduction that turns into the next one, or it's, as you said, title matching. And then it becomes more like, okay, now if I'm an executive and I get this inbound email from another executive, if you get an email from Jamal Reimer, the sales guy, and right after that, you get an email from Bill Gates, whose call are you going to take? Right off the bat, you can see, well, there's celebrity on top of level, but you get the idea. When executives get emails or communications from other executives, they're used to setting up meetings like that all day long. But the first sign of seeing, this is a seller, this is something for somebody else. So that's kind of the, you try to get that warm introduction from somebody who's known. And if not, then it moves on to title matching and kind of on down the cascade, so to speak.
Sure. I'd kick myself if I didn't ask Jamal. I can imagine that you've run into and experienced this situation and executed this very well over, say, all of those different roles that you might have had, and being well versed in closing those enterprise deals. Have you got a quick example of you putting this into practice? I'd love to hear some kind of actual stories of what worked, possibly what didn't work in especially these kind of intro situations.
One situation was at Oracle, and Oracle is a big, big fish. So getting to really senior management at Oracle, number one, isn't easy. It's very hierarchical. The larger the organization, they tend to be more hierarchical just because of the layers. And it's an arduous process of basically writing up why you want access to this person in a briefing document. It's got to go every step of the chain all the way up. And oftentimes it's hard to see if the person you actually want to engage on behalf of the customer is actually any good in front of customers. So there have been situations where I would go very senior and it was a complete mismatch from a personality standpoint, or from a motivation standpoint, or their ability to take coaching from me on what the outcomes needed to be in that meeting. And they kind of go off on their own tangent. That's when things don't work. When you pick the wrong exec, or they're not properly prepped, or not willing to go the route that you need them to go to forward your deal. What does work is I worked at a company once where the CEO, I called him a selling CEO, right? He liked to sell and he felt that he could get in front of anybody that he wanted to. So he's like, yeah, let me help you. You know, if you're trying to get to somebody, I can help out, et cetera. And so in one deal, we found out it was very large international, global pharmaceutical company. And we found a path through one of the global IT consulting shops that somebody very senior who was running the European business for this IT consultant had a deep relationship with the CEO and with the senior vice president of biometrics. And so we positioned a call with our CEO and that external consultant, this very senior managing director. And he just, really kind of ignited a great inspirational conversation about not really the product somewhat, but more about the mission of the company. And she became very enthusiastic and he said, this all fits with the roadmap of IT projects that we are managing on behalf of the customer. And now it's time that I introduce you to this senior vice president and that senior vice president, et cetera. So that I wasn't on that call. I didn't want to be on that call. I wanted that to be a one-on-one call between two senior people and not have anybody else involved, because the very best conversations are one-on-one between two executives. And I always say bigger deals happen faster when you get the right executives in the room or on the phone. So that's an example of when it really works well.
No, I really appreciate you sharing that, Jamal. I find all of those stories super, super powerful, and hopefully others listening will do too. Moving on, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, especially over the last year, I think a lot of sales teams, specifically in software, and have struggled in sales and hitting target and hitting quota, and especially with enterprise. And one of the reasons that they might not move forward with you is because they want to do nothing. They won't, we're not going to move forward with any solution right now, or we'll build in-house rather than necessarily buy a solution. This is particularly prevalent, especially when deal value increases and the investment decision becomes much more significant for the organization, like we're talking about moving up market, more enterprise. You must have navigated through this situation multiple times. What has worked for you previously in at least getting those businesses to buy? And maybe it's just a question of just how you've helped them understand why you're the right decision.
Yeah, this is where I'm at risk of sounding like a one-trick pony, because almost every problem, I won't say every problem, but almost every problem can get solved by ascending above the fray of conversations like that. Because more often than not, the way that we're going to build instead of buy, or we're going to delay or stop the whole thing, typically happens when mid-level managers within the customer account are in some kind of sporadic dialogue with senior level executives, reporting back on, okay, we talked to these three companies, here's the price, et cetera. And then and that's it. Those are the only folks in the room. And then the senior folks go, oh, that's a big bill, and I'm not sure, because they haven't been that involved, and they're just getting the details from the mid-level managers of the worker bees, as I call them, on the very bottom. So they're getting this partial picture from people who are not professional buyers of tech. And so the whole thing looks very uncertain and very expensive. Naturally, they're going to try to push this off or just kibosh it. So the way to either prevent it or fix it's much easier to prevent than it is to fix, because once they get this uncertainty in their head, it's really hard to move them off. So the challenge and the way to success is to have direct relationships at that senior level. Because now, just think of it, if you're somebody who's more like feeling like an owner, right? The senior executives really feel a lot of ownership about the companies that they work for. They think it's not just a job, right? They're really like, what's actually going to work, rather than how do I just push this process through, check the box, and get my bonus. When you're somebody like that, when you're somebody who's really accountable for an outcome and looking at potential ways of creating that outcome, if you're talking with lower level people and you have, partial information, nothing's ever going to move forward because you have no real confidence. And it's not just any confidence, it's confidence in something, doing something large. But when you're eye to eye with a peer on the other side of the table who can deploy resources and has control of large swaths of people or product, and can say, yes, we will go this direction, or no, we won't go in that direction. Or here's what I can do for you that's non-standard, but you've got to do this other thing. Now they're like, okay, now I've got a peer on the other side of the table. Now I have somebody I can work through the complexities, and I don't just immediately need to kind of delay or stop this process, because I've got somebody who, the more I deal with her, the more I trust her. She's actually bringing stuff to me that makes a lot of sense. And now this is more like a partner relationship rather than a vendor in and out transactional relationship. Now I can dig in and actually take some risks, because I think that the risks are worth the payoff.
Yeah, interesting. I'm curious to know, a lot of salespeople find getting executive sponsors, or at least that senior leadership, on a call with them quite difficult. Much more difficult than, say, mid-level or, possibly, the users, right? Do you have any advice for individuals, and especially even sales leaders too, in systemizing how you can get executive sponsors on those calls to have those meaningful conversations more reliably and repeatably for that sales process? As I can imagine, that is probably, a must for enterprise selling, as you just mentioned.
So the kind of stuff that comes to mind first is not something that is 100% actionable by the reps themselves. This is a team effort, and the whole company has to really get into it. I'm a real fan of the saying, and it was a book at one time, always build a well before you're thirsty. And that absolutely applies with trying to connect with executives. It's really hard. As you said, it's really hard to connect with executives. Everybody wants to try. So they're all in line to try to get this person's time. And so that executive has established this whole, multiple lines of defense to save their own time. Now we're seeing, have you ever seen emails that are responses from internal people at your customer, and they say, in the subject line, it auto generates external, right? This is an external email. That's what they got when your email came in. 99% of those never get read. They get deleted or forwarded just immediately. I spoke with a CIO who said that he gets 400 unsolicited emails every week. So in one way, I'm just kind of validating what you're saying by kind of, this is the bar for getting to executives. And now we move on to, that's why it's so important to get off of that super highway of run rate activity, which is, just send more emails, put them on another sequence, just deluge them with coverage. You have to have 29 touches before they'll talk to you. So go execute 29 touches. This is just absolute madness, especially at the executive level. I'm starting to realize this from the opposite way now, because now I'm a founder and it's a company, and now I'm getting all this inbound coming in, and I'm like, this is useless. This is obviously a sequence. And I just write back immediately with, take me off your list. So in building this well before you're thirsty, just think through, where is it that executives spend their time, and with whom are they spending that time? They are 80% of the time, they are in the trenches with their direct reports, which is not a big number of people. A little bit more time, they might go a little bit lower, or they might be doing these big sessions with the rest of the team, etc. 20% of the time, they're externally focused. And externally focused, of that 20%, almost 100% of it is talking to other executives. Why would they need to talk with anybody else? They're going to peers in the industry. They're going to partners. They're going to consultants who really know, SMBs, subject matter experts who really know. How do you get into that flow? How do we become the providers of insights and smart ideas smart ideas about what's the reality that they're facing right now, smart ideas about approaches for dealing with the challenges or the opportunities that are coming up versus, hey, I got a widget. It's a great widget. We should talk about this widget. That's the last thing that they want to talk about. So let me give you some examples. One of the best examples is not a new idea, which is executive roundtables. Now, a lot of selling organizations completely mismanage executive roundtables. The first big mistake is that the outreach for executive events or roundtables is done by individual contributor sellers. So let's say if I'm an executive and I get an inbound email and it's Freddie Johnson, sales guy, come to our executive event. And I'm like, what's so executive about this? I'm being approached by a seller for this. I don't know who's going to be there. This is just not right off the bat. This is it's kind of like a Tupperware party. That's what it's going to be. So they're like, no, thanks. Now I'll give you an example. We really cracked the code in one company that I worked at where we did it in an executive event where the reps were never seen in the process. We did all the legwork. We picked the right executives. We worked with marketing to craft the emails and all that kind of stuff. But all the emails went out either from our head of strategy or our CEO or head of marketing. And we kept it small. It was 15 people or less. And we made the speaker one of our customers. And we didn't even really talk about our product. We just talked about a project that the customer did where they did 5 things different than they normally did. And then they got this amazing result. One of the 5 things was using our software, but they talked about all 5 of those things. So it was clearly not a product pitch. And it was a massively successful 90 minutes. The only 2 people on that call from our company was the CEO and our head of strategy. And it was all these senior vice presidents talking with the one customer who had had this big success, just going through best practice. It was a mastermind. And at the end of it, one of the only things that our CEO said was, did you guys enjoy this? And they're like, oh yeah, this was really, really good stuff. And he said, do you want to do it again? They're like, definitely. Okay. Who wants to be in the hot seat next time? And this other pharmaceutical company. So we'll talk about our innovation. Great. Now we've started this ongoing process where these executives wanted to show up again and again. So I could go on with stuff like this for a while, but that's just a really good example of building this well, digging a well before you're thirsty. A massive deal came out of that. One of the participants was at a huge, another huge global pharmaceutical company that everybody knows. And it turned into almost a 9-figure deal 9 months later, 12 months later. That did not start from cold emails from salespeople to mid-level managers. It started from these kind of activities that the whole company needs to get behind and make work.
Yeah, value first. I can imagine that probably is the starting place for most enterprise deals, if you'd have to sum it up. But thanks for sharing that as well. Amazing stories. But there's the thing, we could probably talk about that all day. All of those little examples. Taking a little bit of a turn here to thinking about times where it hasn't been so successful, or at least tough for you as a salesperson and a sales leader. This is something that we ask, or I ask the sales leaders and elite sellers that we get on this podcast every time and on every episode. And it's this. So you've been in sales for over 3 decades. If you had to pinpoint one thing, and I appreciate this will probably be quite difficult, what has been the toughest moment in your career, if you had to choose one? And how have you dealt with it? Not necessarily to help others avoid those same pitfalls, if they were pitfalls, but to just better deal with that toughest moment if it might be something that someone else would be going through, specifically in enterprise sales.
So I see my career really is in 2 halves over, the first 10 to 15 years and the second 10 to 15 years. First 10-ish years really sucked. I wasn't really very good, so much so that I was fired twice in a row for underperformance. And so my low was that second time getting fired. And, it was a tap on the shoulder saying, our CEO wants to see you at 7:30 tomorrow morning. So, that's a bad start. And I show up, and in a very short conversation, he said, okay, we gave you, you had a goose egg 2 quarters ago. So we gave you one extra shot, and now this quarter just closed in again. You didn't sell a single thing, so we need to let you go. And I was basically escorted out of the building by our head of revenue operations, all the way to the front door. And he waited till the door locked behind me before he went back to the office. So, from going from a team member in the family to, this kind of spurned, useless and unwanted person was a huge hit to the ego, to my confidence. And, it was kind of like, is this role even for me? Is sales even for me? Am I that bad that I can't even hold a job, let alone succeed? So that was the low. How to deal with it? I mean, I didn't really have a choice because I had 2 houses. I had one that I was living in and another that was an investment project that I was trying to rehab at the time. Well, it wasn't like a second home. It was a project. And I had these 2 mortgages and a lot of pressure. So I just had to, push forward and try to get another job. And that very next job came within 3 months, and it was Oracle. So I went from going from really smaller companies into a huge company. Now that wasn't just a saving moment, because the first manager that I had at Oracle was the worst manager of my life. And so, out of the frying pan into the fire. But I guess instead of starting a whole new story, that process of going all the way down to that low, to the point of wondering if this role, this path was even for me, that was the low. Everything after that just got better and better, even with the suffering of bad bosses and these other things. Because a few years after that, I got to do I met my wife, and I moved to Sweden so she can practice medicine. That's where she was trained. And then I got on a great team. And then I got on a great account. And the story of what happened in that first account is the story that I, wrote the book about, Making Deal Secrets. And then that opened my eyes to doing incredibly large deals. We took that account over 9 months from a 10 million run rate company to 50 million, 53 million over 9 months. And that opened my eyes to this other way of selling. And then that became the new normal for me. So that was the story of a absolute low, sticking with it, not sure if it was going to work, but just sticking with it, that turned into something a heck of a lot better. Because, if you just continue to stick with it, ultimately you're going to get your shot, and you have to show up to get that shot. And I'm sure this is oversimplifying a heck of a lot, but that's kind of at the base of it all.
Well, look, I really appreciate you sharing that, Jamal. How much would you attribute that late success, specifically in Oracle, to the failures before within those smaller companies versus that short amount of time that you had at Oracle where everything kind of got flipped on its head and you learned that new way of selling?
Yeah. So with the smaller companies, everybody suffers because there's not a big brand. And so you're always going to have questions, viability questions, SLA questions, quality questions, more so than the big established players, the publicly, the public players. You have other challenges when you're in a public shop. So the upside of being in a really big software company is there's lots of standardization. And, it's not that everybody is amazing at having a great and standardized sales process, but the brand issue is less. And you're going to have in a way, you're going to have a higher level of success when you get to, nobody got fired for hiring IBM kind of mentality. But on the flip side, it's really hard to excel, because the bigger the company, this isn't always true, but it's often true. The bigger the company, the worse the comp plan. And the difference there is that pre-public companies are most interested in revenue. Post-public companies are most interested in profit. So when they're most interested in revenue, the sellers are just the heroes because they're bringing exactly that in and they get a bigger chunk of it. Once they're public, profit matters and sellers look more like a cost of sale. So the companies try to minimize the overall cost of the sale, and therefore because the brand is there and more sales come because of that brand, they say, well, the seller is not as influential and therefore we don't need to pay him as much. So the upside of the big companies is the brand and standardization of certain processes. The downside is it's harder to excel.
Thinking about working through enterprise sales, I think one of the biggest things that I hear either reps and sales leaders kind of, I guess, worry about in enterprise sales is trust, right? The need to earn trust with a lot of different individuals and the number of individuals that you have to earn trust with as well. What steps could or would you take to help appeal to so many different roles within, and we've touched on this slightly over the last couple of questions anyway, to help you appeal to those different stakeholders within that process and those personalities, especially if you aren't able to engage with them personally, right? Like say on one of those one-on-one calls and have that opportunity. What are the kind of things that you would advise others on to help build that trust with those different personalities and roles ahead of being able to do something more personally, say on a call?
When your selling reality becomes more complex, like you're describing, and the number of stakeholders, firstly within the customer stakeholder, but then necessarily from within your own, your deal team grows to match, it becomes, you move from multi-threading to stakeholder mapping. What I mean by that is multi-threading. Somebody told me this and I really agree with it relatively recently. Multi-threading is really a word that's a reminder to people who are selling in, SMB mid-market that, hey, you need to talk to more people than just one person. Because sometimes you could actually get away with it at that lower level of sale, right? It's so obvious at the enterprise level that it actually morphs into mapping, which is, okay, I am one person, but we got to cover 10 people, maybe 20. Can't do it myself. So now I need to go get the best people within my company to be my A team. And I need to shift my mentality of selling from Batman and Robin, right? Two guys duking it out with a couple of bad guys here and there. You can do 100K deals with that model all day long. We got to move away from that and move to really being the field marshal of the Roman legion, right? This is not a couple of, these are the $1 million, the $10 million deals where you're no longer doing all the sales activities yourselves. You're deploying the best people on your team. Okay, she matches with him. He matches with her. He matches with this guy because, okay, they're at the right level or the personality or the function that they're in. Great. You guys go have the relationships. And sometimes it's even better because the seller isn't even a part of that. And then they have a very tailored relationship and conversation that's about a product or a function or a process or a problem. And so if you want to kind of break it down in kind of the big steps, the first step is just to identify who the right people are to engage. Clearly there will be execs, but there will also be mid-level folks and worker bees who can add value to the overall conversation. Once they're identified, then you got to figure out, okay, who am I going to put on each one of these folks? Maybe I start and then introduce, or maybe I just have them begin the introductory process, or I have my coach or my growing sponsor be the one to make those introductions. And then you start to map that conversation. And then you need an internal cadence to keep in touch with all the conversations that are going on, because now you're working at the level of delegation. So you need check-ins. So there's more detail to it, but that's kind of, you could think of it as kind of those three levels. Identify the right people, map your team to those people, and then have a system weekly checking up on how those conversations are going.
It's interesting you say that because it's that extra layer with enterprise. I think that that people miss out on, especially, I mean, everyone's always got, regardless of whether you're SMB, mid-market, I think everyone's always got the idea they want to move up market. And part of that is multi-threading, right? It's multi-threading with more stakeholders, yet I think it's super helpful to outline the real difference between a real enterprise sale and the detail and the communication that's needed for running a process like that, not only from their team, but your team as well. So I really appreciate you expanding on that. This is the last question. This is going to be the last question. I think this is going to sum up some of the things that, or I hope so, it's going to sum up some of the things that you've mentioned today. Wish there were many. And having been a successful salesperson yourself and having led successful teams yourself, if you had to name one thing that would probably make, say, an 80-20 difference also, but a one kind of main issue, what do sales leaders often get wrong when building a repeatable enterprise sales motion?
They rely too heavily on the sales motions and playbooks, frameworks that worked at the lower segments, commercial, mid-market, and SMB. So I work with lots of sellers and sales leaders. And the biggest complaint from the sellers is that I want to do bigger deals. I've got these large accounts and our mandate is to do bigger deals and to get higher, but nobody can tell me internally how to do it. They just tell me to go do it. And largely they're saying, go do more activity, more emails, more phone calls, more demos, more meetings. And there's no insight into how to make those interactions meaningful and how to actually make them, move deals forward. So I'd say the biggest thing that sales leaders get wrong is saying, okay, I'm just going to apply what's worked at the lower levels to these bigger accounts. And then it just completely falls flat. A lot of that isn't really the fault of the sales leaders themselves. Here's what a lot of sales leaders tell me. They kind of look around, we'll get on the one-on-one, but it feels like they're looking around and they say, Jamal, I was not an IC that long before I got into management. Definitely, I was not an individual contributor so long that I learned how to do the big deals myself. So I don't know how to teach my reps or coach my reps on how to do the complex sale because I'd never done it. How does it work? How is it different? And then that becomes like, coach the coach, et cetera. So it's understandable that a lot of sales leaders haven't had the experience to know how's the playbook different.
Amazing. Well, for anyone listening, I think it's a perfect segue. Jamal, you also do a bit of coaching, and for enterprise sellers looking to get or lean on networks and learn and upskill, Jamal's got a fantastic enterprise sellers network for those individuals and sales leaders to learn and develop those skills in more detail. Jamal, those are all of the questions that I had for you today. I really appreciate you taking the time and chatting to me. For anyone listening that wants more resources on Jamal and the Mega Deal Secrets book, we'll have some links and all of the different resources that in some of the topics that we mentioned in today's episode. You'll find that below and linked to wherever you are listening or watching this podcast. Before we wrap up, Jamal, is there anything you would like to leave the audience with, whether they are a rep wanting to jump into enterprise sales or a sales leader thinking about how to map out an enterprise sales process for their team?
I think the biggest thing that I would finish up on is just this idea that there are really two types of selling realities. And I characterize them as the old and the new, or the hard and the fulfilling. The way that we all kind of grew up in sales is what I call run rate selling. It's this volume, velocity sales that is absolutely soul sucking. And it's extremely inefficient when it comes to the enterprise sale, which is what everybody's ambition typically is, to get to the enterprise level. The alternative, I had my eyes open to it the first time I did a large deal. I was coached and mentored by my head of sales, my head of services, is this other way of selling, which is not voluminous activity, but rather smart and strategic activity. It's doing, instead of doing a whole bunch of small deals. It's doing a few larger deals in a way that you don't crush your soul and, expend all of your energy with these kind of mundane tasks. And I hate run rate. And if I had to do that, I would leave the profession. But there's such a better way. And my whole purpose, my whole mission in what I do, I would love if every ambitious seller got away from relying on run rate selling and learned and then relied on this, a healthier, more profitable, more impactful way of selling. I would encourage everybody who's listening to this to think about that. And if you haven't heard of or know of, or if you're not really aware of what that other side is like, start to investigate it. You could read my book, but talk to other sellers who have done these large deals or other sales leaders who run teams that have done it. It's night and day. And it's like whether it's worth sticking around for this or whether, it's time to think about going to do something else.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Jamal, for taking the time. And for all those listening, we'll see you next week. Cheers.